"You mean landed?" "Well, hooked, at any rate, and putting up a very poor struggle." "Why, you clever little devil, you! You'll be making me look like a stock girl next." Fanny did not telephone Heyl until the day she left New York. She had told herself she would not telephone him at all. He had sent her his New York address and telephone number months before, after that Sunday at the dunes. Ella Monahan had finished her work and had gone back to Chicago 4 days before Fanny was ready to leave. In those 4 days Fanny had scoured the city from the Palisades to Pell Street. I don't know how she found her way about. It was sort of instinct with her. She seemed to scent the picturesque. She never for a moment neglected her work. But she had found it was often impossible to see these New York business men until 10, sometimes 11, o'clock. She awoke at 7, a habit formed in her Winnebago days. 8:30 one morning found her staring up at the dim vastness of the dome of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The great gray pile, mountainous, almost ominous, looms up in the midst of the dingy commonplaceness of Amsterdam Avenue and 110th Street. New Yorkers do not know this, or if they know it, the fact does not interest them. New Yorkers do not go to stare up into the murky shadows of this glorious edifice. They would if it were situate in Rome. Bare, crude, unfinished, chaotic, it gives rich promise of magnificent fulfillment. In an age when great structures are thrown up today to be torn down tomorrow, this slow-moving giant is at once a reproach and an example. 25 years in building, 25 more for completion, it has elbowed its way, stone by stone, into such company as St. Peter's at Rome and the Marvel at Milan. Fanny found her way down the crude cinder paths that made an alley-like approach to the cathedral. She entered at the side door that one found by following arrows posted on the rough wooden fence. Once inside, she stood a moment, awed by the immensity of the half-finished nave. As she stood there, hands clasped, her face turned raptly up to where the massive granite columns reared their height to frame the choir, she was, for the moment, as devout as any Episcopalian whose money had helped make the great building. Not only devout, but prayerful, ecstatic. That was partly due to the effect of the pillars, the lights, the tapestries, the great unfinished chunks of stone that loomed out from the side walls, and the purple shadow cast by the window above the chapels at the far end, and partly to the actress in her that responded magically to any mood and always to surroundings. Later she walked softly down the deserted nave, past the choir, to the cluster of chapels, set like gems at one end, and running from north to south in a semicircle. A placard outside one said, "St. Saviour's Chapel, for those who wish to rest and pray." All white marble, this little nook, gleaming softly in the gray half-light. Fanny entered and sat down. She was quite alone. The roar and crash of the 8th Avenue L, the Amsterdam cars, the motors drumming up Morningside Hill were softened here to a soothing hum. For those who wish to rest and pray. Fanny Brandeis had neither rested nor prayed since that hideous day when she had hurled her prayer of defiance at him. But something within her now began a groping for words that should follow an ancient plea beginning, "O God of my fathers." But at that the picture of the room came back to her mental vision. The room so quiet except for the breathing of the woman on the bed, the woman with the tolerant, humorous mouth, and the straight, clever nose, and the softly bright brown eyes, all so strangely pinched and shrunken looking now. Fanny got to her feet, with a noisy scraping of the chair on the stone floor. The vague, half-formed prayer died at birth. She found her way out of the dim, quiet little chapel, up the long aisle, and out the great door. She shivered a little in the cold of the early January morning as she hurried toward the Broadway subway. At 9:30 she was standing at a counter in the infants' wear section at Beth's, making mental notes while the unsuspecting saleswoman showed her how the pink ribbon in this year's models was brought under the beading, French fashion, instead of weaving through it as heretofore. At 10:30 she was saying to Sid Udell, "I think a written contract is always best. Then we'll all know just where we stand. Mr. Fenger will be out next week to arrange the details, but just now a very brief written understanding to show him on my return would do." And she got it, and tucked it away in her bag in triumph. She tried to leave New York without talking to Heyl, but some quiet, insistent force impelled her to act contrary to her resolution. It was, after all, the urge of the stronger wish against the weaker. When he heard her voice over the telephone, Heyl did not say, "Who is this?" Neither did he put those inevitable questions of the dweller to the transient. Where are you? How long have you been here? What he said was, how are you going to avoid dining with me tonight? To which Fanny replied promptly, by taking the 20th Century back to Chicago today. A little silence. A hurt silence. Then, when they get the 20th Century habit, they're as good as lost. How's the infants' wear business, Fanny? Booming, thank you. I want to tell you I've read the column every day. It's wonderful stuff. It's a wonderful job. I'm a lucky boy. I'm doing the thing I'd rather do than anything else in the world. There are mighty few who can say that. There was another silence, awkward, heavy. Then, Fanny, you're not really leaving today. I'll be in Chicago tomorrow, barring wrecks. You might have let me show you our more or less fair city. I've shown it to myself. I've seen Riverside Drive at sunset and at night. That alone would have been enough. But I've seen Fulton Market, too, and the Grand Street stalls, and Washington Square, and Central Park, and Lady Duff Gordon's inner showroom, and the Night Court, and the Grand Central Subway horror at 6 p.m., and the gambling on the curb, and the bench sleepers in Madison Square. Oh, Clancy, the misery! Hey, wait a minute. All this alone? Yes. And one more thing. I've landed Horn and Udell, which means nothing to you, but to me it means that by spring my department will be a credit to its stepmother, a real success. I knew it would be a success. So did you. Anything you might attempt would be successful. You'd have made a successful lawyer, or cook, or actress, or hydraulic engineer, because you couldn't do a thing badly. It isn't in you. You're a superlative sort of person. But that's no reason for being any of those things. If you won't admit a debt to humanity, surely you'll acknowledge you've an obligation to yourself. Preaching again. Goodbye. Fanny, you're afraid to see me. Don't be ridiculous. Why should I be? Because I say out loud the things you daren't let yourself think. If I were to promise not to talk about anything but flannel bands, will you promise? No. But I'm going to meet you at the clock at the Grand Central Station 15 minutes before train time. I don't care if every infants' wear manufacturer in New York had a prior claim on your time. You may as well be there, because if you're not, I'll get on the train and stay on as far as Albany. Take your choice. He was there before her. Fanny, following the wake of a red cap, picked him at once from among the crowd of clock waiters. He saw her at the same time, and started forward with that singularly lithe, springy step which was, after all, just the result of perfectly trained muscles in coordination. He was wearing New York clothes, the right kind, Fanny noted. Their hands met. How well you look, said Fanny, rather lamely. It's the clothes, said Hale, and began to revolve slowly, coyly, hands out, palms down, eyelids drooping, in delicious imitation of those ladies whose business it is to revolve thus for fashion. Clancy, you idiot! All these people! Stop it! But get the grace. Get the easy English hang, at once so loose and so clinging. Fanny grinned appreciatively, and led the way through the gate to the train. She was surprisingly glad to be with him again. On discovering that, she began to talk rapidly, and about him. Tell me, how do you manage to keep that fresh viewpoint? Everybody else who comes to New York to write loses his identity. The city swallows him up. I mean by that things seem to strike you as freshly as they did when you first came. I remember you wrote me an amazing letter. For one thing, I've never been anything but a foreigner in New York. I'll never quite believe Broadway. I'll never cease to marvel at Fifth Avenue and Cooper Union and the Bronx. The time may come when I can take the subway for granted, but don't ask it of me just yet. But the other writers, and all those people who live down in Washington Square? I never see them. It's sure death. Those Greenwichers are always taking out their own feelings and analyzing them and pawing them over and passing them around. When they get through with them they're so thumb-marked and greasy that no one else wants them. They don't get enough golf, those Greenwichers. They don't get enough tennis. They don't get enough walking in the open spaces. Gosh, no. I know better than to fall for that kind of thing. They spend hours talking to each other in dim-lighted attics about souls and society and the joy of life and the greater good, and they know all about each other's insides. They talk themselves out, and there's nothing left to write about. A little of that kind of thing purges and cleanses. Too much of it poisons and clogs. No, ma'am. When I want to talk, I go down and chin with the foreman of our composing room. There's a chap that has what I call conversation. A philosopher, and knows everything in the world. Composing room foremen always are, and do. Now that's all of that. How about Fanny Brandeis? Any sketches? Come on, confess. Grand Street, anyway. I haven't touched a pencil except to add up a column of figures or copy an order since last September, when you were so sure I couldn't stop. You've done 1,000 in your head, And if you haven't done one on paper, so much the better. You'll jam them back and stifle them, and